Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know your feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at doleinstitute@ku.edu. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We'd like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you're interested. The 2020 Fort Leavenworth series will kick off on January 9th with Jonathan Abel presenting on 1809 Napoleon's Turning Point. And the theme of the 2020 series is Turning Points in Military History. After the presentation, we will have some time for audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now please join me in welcoming the Director of the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Dave Cotter.
Hey, thanks, Emily. Thank you and good afternoon. And I want to thank everybody here for their continued support. Our collaboration with the Dole Center has been very rewarding, all the more so because of your support for our presentation. So thank you for being here. And this is the last of our series on generals you've never heard of. And it's going to be presented today by Dr. Geoff Babb, a member of our faculty, who took his doctorate right here at the University of Kansas. Geoff is a retired military intelligence, special forces, and foreign area officer with Asia as a specialty, China in particular. And Geoff's done a considerable amount of research and dissertation work on the China-Burma-India campaign, and he's going to share some of that with us with his presentation on General Pinkie Dorn. Geoff?
I guess I should ask first, who here has heard of General Pinkie Dorn? Ah, good. You can leave. All right. No, because I have studied the China-Burma-India theater, the name Dorn just kept popping up. And mostly because one of the first books I read was Walkout with Stillwell in Burma, which he wrote. He later wrote a novel as well. And he has a historic work on the Sino from 1937 to 1941, the Second Sino-Japanese War, which I just bought on Amazon, as a matter of fact. It's still out there. So I want to talk about General Pinkie Dorn. He is, in my opinion, one of the most unique of the officers who served anywhere in the United States Army, and especially in China. And this soldier, artist, author, and China hand, or as the Chinese would say, Zhongbo Tong, I will try to walk through all those parts as we go through this. I'm not sure that this is the most easily readable, so I will read it. This is General Wedemeyer, who was General Dorn's boss after Stillwell was relieved in October of 1944. And their 3 months together is stormy at best. So what this OER says, does he render willing and generous support to the plans of his superiors, regardless of his personal views in the matter? No. Of all the general officers personally known to me, I would place him 499 out of 500. This is a very unusual U.S. Army efficiency report. But he will also recommend that Dorn be reduced in rank to lieutenant colonel and is relieved of his command, and I'll get to that later. So, I'm going to talk to you about an officer who is very, very unique, because at the end, he will be promoted back to brigadier. What am I going to talk about? Well, we're going to try to do a whole bunch of things. We'll use Pinkie Dorn to talk about the U.S. Army's role in China from 1900 basically all the way through 1945. We'll describe the life and times of an officer who graduates from West Point and then goes out into the Army and then moves along between the two wars. Provide an overview of the China-Burma-India theater, 41 to 45. Discuss the issues of advising, training, and equipping a foreign army. And I will return to this at the very last slide because it is one of the key missions that we have today and one of the increasing missions with increasing numbers of U.S. units being brought about to do it. Talk about the Stillwell, Chennault, Hurley, Wedemeyer mess. And I didn't put Chiang Kaishek in there because I don't want to add that much more complexity to it. These four are plenty. And we'll talk about how they don't get along. And Hurley was a senator, I think, from Oklahoma, and was his own special breed of cat. Highlight the U.S. Army missions post-war. What ends in 45, again, is a beginning to limited war in the post-Cold War era, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I want to comment on foreign area officers, of which I was one. The United States Army has trained from 3 to 5 U.S. Army officers in Chinese language, culture, history, international security affairs since 1919, when Stillwell went over. They had 4 years of language. I was in the class that went over in 84, 85, and we had a year and a half plus a year and DLI. And I'll tell you, with 2.5 years of Chinese language, I know why Stillwell needed 4. But Dorn happened to be one of the people selected later on to be a China foreign area officer, and I'll talk about that. But that is a long tradition that still exists, where the United States Army specifically trains people in languages, cultures, international political affairs. And so I'll comment on that. And then these new things called the Security Force Assistance Brigades, that's essentially what Dorn did in training the Chinese. So that's the task that I'm going to set out to do, and we'll see how it works. Oh, by the way, this book, written by a guy named Cornebise, which I don't think I'm pronouncing right. It's a French name. Cornebise? This is free and online, and if anybody wants it, they send a message back through. I'll send them either the digits or it was a book that was done by the Army University Press, so it's freely available. All right. The United States Army's role in China, for all intents and purposes, starts in 1900 at the Boxer Rebellion. And with the Boxer Rebellion, we have basically elements of 3 infantry regiments, the 9th, 14th, and 15th. And it's looking at those, plus a cavalry regiment, plus an artillery regiment, plus Marines, plus Navy. We are going to stay in China, the United States military, for the next 41 years. So how long do you want to be in Iraq and Afghanistan? When you get to 41, call me. Because then I'll say, oh, it's historic that we've left. We tend to go and we tend to stay. If you count a little bit differently, Taiwan, then we'll have U.S. Army officers in uniform all the way through 79. So the United States Army's relationship with China is more than 70 years. So it's approaching that with, Japan and Germany right now. But this is where it begins. The same author of this book has these 2 books, the 15th Infantry that's there from 1912 to 1938. But if you look at the 9th, 14th and 31st, there's a history that goes 1900 to 1938, where there are large U.S. Army units in China, in addition to the attachés and the students. The bottom picture is of a thoroughly hated colonel. This guy shows up, and he is a physical fitness nut, and he takes all these wonderful soldiers that have been sitting around having the Chinese do their laundry, their meals, and any other physical work that needed to be done, and he decided that these soldiers were soft and needed to get out and go to work, and so this is them on one of his historic 20-mile hikes. In that unit, virtually Wedemeyer and Stillwell will both serve. That unit was famous in the United States Army at the time as the unit to go to for an overseas assignment. The other ones are probably in the Philippines. So, Dorn graduates from West Point in 1923. He's a very, very good student, but he frivels away his time writing plays and artwork and going down to New York City to the art community, and still manages to do relatively well in the class. He will be selected as an artillery officer and head for Fort Sam Houston, Texas. That's his lieutenant assignment. He'll then go to the Philippines. And in the Philippines, he will start to make a name for himself as an artist. He also studies the Negrito people on the island of Luzon and writes a dictionary. And he also does a map of Fort Stotzenberg that gets sold in the PX that he gets royalties on for many, many, many years. So he almost got out of the Army because there was an anthropologist there, and I'm sorry that Felix Moose is not here because I could talk to Felix about anthropology a little bit. An anthropologist said, you need to get out of the Army and come to work for me. So he thought about getting out of the Army and pursuing an academic career in anthropology. He did not. He returns to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to continue as an instructor in the artillery school, but at that time they were reaching out into the Army to grab officers to lead civilian conservation corps units. It just so happened with his anthropological work in the Philippines, he did a lot of camping. He would go out with 3 or 4 men, 10 men, and natives and stay out doing field research. So when somebody said to him, how'd you like to go to Oregon and camp out for a while? He said, got it, anything better than staying here at Fort Sill. And so off he went. And so he served for a time, first goes to St. Louis for a training period, and then is assigned out to Oregon with the Civilian Conservation Corps. On your left is the map of Beijing. This picture I took off the internet about a week ago as it was for sale on the internet. The copies of it are still out there, still being used as a tourist map of Beijing, which is, again, the Stotzenberg map. He actually will make another map down at San Antonio, and so he becomes famous for his ability to do this artwork. And I found a picture of what Beijing looks like in 1935. And I thought this picture, for some of you who may have been to Beijing, there's massive changes in Beijing, but in the midst of Beijing are still all these old and wonderful buildings that luckily Mao and the communists did not tear them all down. They tore down the wall, but for the Olympics, they built a bunch of them back. So it's hard to tell now what's old and what's new. But this is a street scene, and he was there in 1937 as a language student. This picture is of the military attaché staff in Beijing in 1936. In red is Stillwell. In blue is Dorn. And in green is a guy named Roberts. And a friend of mine in the back of the room knows the relationship. Roberts is a distant relative of Senator Roberts. It's his uncle. And Roberts will end up being Stillwell's G2. And Dorn will end up being either the chief of staff or operations officer or whatever Stillwell wants him to do officer. So in this close, tight-knit group of military officers, of Army officers in this case, will come the senior leadership of the China-Burma-India theater. One of the others that's in here that I probably should have looked at is an officer that will serve with a communist, and I have a slide in here later, and that has its own fraught problem. Major Roberts is catching a ride up the Yangtze on a Navy boat called the Panay. And it just so happens that the day he's on that, it gets attacked. Nearly completely sunk, multiple casualties, to include the captain. So the senior military person on the USS Panay is Roberts. And for his actions in saving the crew and surviving the incident, he's awarded a Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest medal for valor in our system. So in the archives, there are letters between Roberts and Stillwell, because Stillwell, as the senior attaché, is tasking these junior officers to do observations of the Japanese. Because the war with Japan, between China and Japan, will begin on the 7th of July in 1937. It's a little too easy to say the war's over by 38. But in 1937 and 1938, by attacking south from Beijing and inland from Shanghai, the Japanese will drive Chiang Kaishek and his government to Chongqing. And so by October of 1938, the Chinese government has moved all the way from Nanjing to Chongqing. Why are they safe in Chongqing is a question that normally gets asked, and I'll try to answer it. The Japanese, with between 2.5 to 3.5 million soldiers, are trying to control China with 400 million plus people. And the communications links, air, land, and sea, are mostly on the eastern third of the country. To get all the way up the Yangtze River to Chongqing and to maintain the logistics lines that they would need to conduct large-scale combat operations all the way to Chongqing is beyond the capability of the Japanese military. So it is a relatively safe place to be. It will be very, very heavily bombed. And in the war crimes of the Chinese, I had not realized this. Everybody thinks the war crimes tribunals were in Tokyo, but there were war crimes tribunals that were done by the Chinese in China, by the Brits in Hong Kong and in other places. So there wasn't just one Nuremberg of Asia. There were multiples. But for all intents and purposes, the job of the U.S. military attachés in China from 1937 to 1941 was to observe the combat between the Japanese and the Chinese and report it back to Washington, D.C. And so that's what Dorn's job is as one of the attachés. It's a very dangerous job. He goes to very dangerous places. He is normally alone, or very often he travels with one of the reporters. So he travels with Belden, he travels with some others, and I've got a slide on that. He lives in Beijing in this very small community of expats, and they know each other. They travel in the same social circles. And if there's one thing you can say about Dorn, he was social. He wasn't married, but he had a lot of lady friends. He hired servants, and he kept a huge house. And he was a party guy. But in that, he got to know virtually everybody that was anybody there. So I've got Agnes Smedley. She and there are several other famous Edgar Snow. Edgar Snow's wife was also a newspaper person there, and then there's others that can be put on there. I mean, there are several books that have been written on the reporters in China, and the attachés and the reporters knew each other well. They knew what was being reported, and they often traveled together. In 1939, he's relieved of duties as an attaché. It's time to come home. Why is it time to come home? Because the United States Army said, you have been overseas for 4 years. It's time to come home. You're a homesteader, which is a very bad term in the Army. You're supposed to move around in the Army to do the different jobs. So he had been there too long doing the same thing. It was time to come home. So he comes home, as well as Stillwell, and will basically join the 2nd Infantry Division at Fort Sam Houston. And again, if you look at that date, this is the time where we're just now beginning to bring the United States Army back together again. It is about 250,000. Within 6 years, it will be 8.5 million. It will go from a handful of divisions in the active and National Guard, 20 plus, to 89 divisions. Part of that is training. So the next job is to go to the Presidio of Monterey, and he will become a training officer in the 7th Infantry Division at Fort Ord, and then with the Corps. And the 7th ID first belongs to Stillwell, then he goes up to Corps. The other patch, the Sunshine Patch, is the 40th Infantry Division, which still exists today. It's the California National Guard. It was commanded by a horribly political officer with no military talent. And Vinegar Joe Stillwell showed his suffering fools poorly and not understanding politics early. And who's right there beside him? Dorn. So, they take the 7th ID and the 40th ID out on a large-scale maneuver between Ord and Fort Lewis, Washington, and the National Guard general doesn't do very well and starts to understand he might not like this job very much for real and leaves the job. Stillwell installs a general who will do very well. These two divisions will fight all the way through World War II. They will both be in the Philippines. They then get called in December of 41 as the war breaks out. General Marshall starts to call senior officers to Washington, D.C., and putting into planning positions. And you'd be kind of surprised, but the first plan that Stillwell and Dorn had to work out was to go into Dakar, Senegal, and attack from Dakar up into Morocco. Now, what will later happen will be Torch, where we will do an amphibious landing, but the original was to go into Senegal. And as Dorn said, luckily, we didn't have to do that one, because planning it wasn't any fun and probably wasn't going to work. But the idea that the United States Army wasn't going to stay out of the fight for long was there. We were offensively minded, and we were going to go get in the fight somewhere. Marshall, of course, wanted to get into the fight in 42 by going into France. And that's a whole other story for another time. In February of 1942, they leave the United States, and they will head to China. Stillwell will be the second choice after Yu Drum to go to China to be Chiang Kai-shek's deputy. And I'll show you all the other jobs that he had in a few minutes. We had a mission, part of Lend-Lease, with China. It started back in the late summer, early fall of 41. So while we were not yet at war with the Japanese, we were supplying, we were doing the things that are on this. Advise and assist the Chinese government in procurement, transport, maintenance of materials and equipment, training. work with the other parts of the government on how to do this, which is a very interesting job for an Army officer. How would we know what the Department of Commerce or Transportation? Well, we do. It's part of the training of that foreign area officer and the attachés to work across the government. And then that fourth bullet, the Chinese are horrible with the administration, but the money was starting to flow and the Lend-Lease was starting to flow, even though the Chinese were certainly third on the list. It was the Russians and the Soviets and the Brits who received most of Lend-Lease. Somewhere between 4 and 5% of the Lend-Lease went to China. Then, explore the vital port, road, and railroad facilities with a view to establishment of adequate lines of communication. Get out there and be global scouts, trying to figure out how to get stuff from place to place. Most people don't realize how much stuff that we got to the Soviet Union in terms of Lend-Lease through Iran, for instance. And there was also a look here to try to have a route to China through the Soviet Union. Stillwell gets there, and it's in the middle of a fight immediately. The Japanese are taking Burma. And Stillwell will be given command of 3 Chinese corps, 2 of which are there. The Chinese offered the Brits 6 divisions initially. The Brits only had 2 divisions in Burma. And depends who you read. Why didn't the Brits immediately take these 6 Chinese divisions, put them into that order of battle and defend Burma? Well, the Brits claim it's because they could barely supply the logistics to the 2 divisions that they had. They didn't know how they would take care of these Chinese divisions, who come mostly without logistics. And that's going to be most of what we will do during the war, is provide logistics to what starts out to be over 500 Chinese divisions. But, rough estimate, it will take at least 10 to 15 Chinese divisions to defeat 1 Japanese division. So, we got the hell beat out of us, and it was humiliating as hell, and we ought to get right back in there. Stillwell wanted a corps with 2 divisions of Americans in the China-Burma-India theater. One of the reasons that Hugh Drum said I won't go is when asked how many U.S. soldiers he'd have under him, combat units he'd have under him, the answer was 0. For all intents and purposes, Stillwell will have 1 regiment of 3 battalions of U.S. soldiers in the China-Burma-India theater. That's it. Merrill's Marauders. He never gets American soldiers. And the idea is pretty simple. Why would I send American soldiers when I got 500 Chinese divisions? There's plenty of manpower over there. Let's build them. So you're not getting any. Your job is to build them. And the primary builder of those units will be General Dorn. It doesn't go well. Chiang Kaishek knew of Stillwell when Stillwell was a language student as a major. Knew he was, and as a colonel attaché. And so in 1937, it's Colonel Stillwell. In 1942, it's Lieutenant General Stillwell, and he's the chief of staff. So I wrote down the narrative. This would be the narrative that you would get from Stillwell. Chiang was a corrupt politician and a warlord, not a general, a soldier, or a true ally. He was saving the Nationalist Army to fight the Communists, and after 1940 would not engage the Japanese. He opted for Chennault's plan of victory through air power. Anybody know what Chennault's rank was when he retired from the United States Air Force in, 36? Captain. He was not well thought of by the U.S. Army Air Corps, U.S. Army Air Force brass, or the Army brass. But he had a very wonderful relationship with especially Mrs. Chiang Kai-shek, who basically gave him his first airplane when we went over there so he could fly around and see what was going on. And he was in charge of training the Chinese Air Force. It was mostly about logistics and how much logistics were going to go to building Army units versus building air units that caused the biggest fight between Chennault and Stillwell. And Chiang tended to side with Chennault. Ramgarh. This is the place when the Brits and the Chinese were run out of Burma, 2 Chinese divisions went to Ramgarh. They will become the core of the Chinese army in India, and they will be the vanguard of the fight to take back Burma or to take back northern Burma. If you notice this picture, there's a guy out front that's got an American helmet on, and all the people around him have got British helmets. The British supplied the uniforms and equipment early on to these divisions, but we supplied the trainers. And we will do that from 1942 until 1945 here. So this is called Ramgarh, and at Ramgarh you have X-Force and the Chinese Army in India, and we're trying to get Chiang Kaishek to allow us to bring soldiers from China to India to train. Now the Indians were not particularly happy about this, nor were the British really. So there were a lot of diplomatic issues. Again, Dorn and Stillwell had worked in the embassy, knew these guys, and were able to play it. And eventually, more Chinese soldiers were sent there. And we have U.S. NCOs that are training Chinese generals. We were able to overcome a lot of the cultural issues because at the beginning of the war, there were about 30 U.S. Army officers who had gone through the 4-year training program and were available to be amongst that training establishment in China to help it run better through cultural understanding. This is a terrible chart, but I'm an Army guy. You've got to have a line and block chart. The only thing that you need to know, there's a lot of stuff on here. These units at the bottom, these are divisions. Let's just say these are 9 divisions. The total number of divisions in the United States Army today is 10. So we will start out, Dorn will start out being part of training 60 divisions, minus a few. And there was supposed to be another 30. Chiang Kai-shek was promised 90 divisions, trained, equipped with advisors, in November in Cairo. We got to 39. But this is what Dorn does. This is what Dorn is in charge of. Stillwell, as I'm going to show you, has got all kinds of jobs, but Dorn's primary job is to oversee the training and equipping of these 90, well, starting with 60 and then planning for 90 divisions. Cairo Conference. The conference here is followed by Tehran. And Joseph Stalin is asked, when are you going to go to war with the Japanese? And supposedly he says, 90 days after VE Day, I'll join the war. So when do the Soviets attack the Japanese in Manchuria? 90 days after May the 8th. They do exactly what they said they were going to do years before. So there's all kinds of stuff about the planning of these planning conferences and what they did. The Cairo conference is when it's decided. Batten comes from the China-Burma-India theater, others, and they have 7 missions they want to do. It gets reduced to 4. But China is not the forgotten theater. It is part of the total war planning from the beginning, from before the war. Then there's a problem with the Japanese, because the enemy always gets a vote. And on this map, I depict the Ichigo offensive. In April of 1944, just as Stillwell is leading the Chinese Army of India from Lido to what will be Myitkyina, the Japanese attack, and there's three possible outcomes. One, this is actually going to Hong Kong. Two, it's going to Hanoi and the ports in Vietnam. And the third is that it's going to Kunming and Chongqing. Chiang Kaishek says, they're coming for me. They're coming to take me out. And so there is a huge food fight between Stillwell and Chiang Kai-shek on the divisions that are supposed to go to Burma to clear the line of communication in Burma. And they're held back. Dorn is part of that fight. And actually, he meets with Mrs. Chiang. He meets with Chiang. They try to make it work. Stillwell has too many jobs. There's a 1 through 6 on here. He's Chiang Kai-shek's deputy. He's Mountbatten's deputy, and Mountbatten is in Ceylon, Sri Lanka. So it has to work. And then you have the U.S. side. So where's Dorn? This is Chinese Training and Combat Command. It belongs to Stillwell. Dorn is his man to do it. Chiang Kai-shek also doesn't like it in August of 1944 when the United States Army, Navy, State Department put a team with Mao Zedong in Yan'an. Matter of fact, Chiang was furious about this. It will end up that we will stay there until February of 1947. So there is a U.S. Army team. There's actually a joint team with Mao from August 44 to March of 47. And because of that, we get to know the communists very, very well. And Army officers in general are going to report back favorably through channels about this Army. They're going to also report very unfavorably back about Chiang. If you want to find people that fight, according to the Army officers, go to Yan'an. This is the offensive that Dorn will lead. And this is a picture. This is Merrill's Marauders. These are the Chinese crossing the Salween. This is Merrill with Stillwell. But this campaign starts out of Lido in January of 43. We will not capture Myitkyina until August of 44. And it is not Stillwell's finest day. Merrill's Marauders isn't big enough, strong enough, hardy enough to do the job. He is supported by, at various times, between 6 and 12 Chinese divisions. But it is a very tough country to fight in. It's a very tough war to be in. And one is always worried in Burma about the monsoons. This is Dorn standing in Tiancheng. If I go back to this map, Tiancheng is in here. Mandalay. Yeah, I have a hard time seeing it myself now. This is Myitkyina. This is the distance they have to go, but it's a very, and up here, this is the road to Kunming, so Dole is coming in this way. You might think that Dorn wasn't a real field soldier, but he was. And his actions during this particular campaign will show that. And Stillwell would not put up with officers who did not fight well. He relieved a whole bunch of folks around Myitkyina for not being offensive enough. But it wasn't Dorn. This Tiancheng here is where this picture is. By this time, we have air superiority in the north, and for all intents and purposes, 3 Chinese divisions take a Japanese reinforced regiment out of a castle, for all intents and purposes. But if you go from Tiancheng, there's Myitkyina. And so this will drive the Japanese out of northeast and north-central Burma. It's hard to see this, but the numbers of divisions is unbelievable. In blue are the Chinese armies, 1,046 armies in the north, 12 armies, over 200,000 men, 4 armies of 100,000 men, 320,000 men. We are mostly training these guys down here. This is Y Force. This is the force in Kunming that's being trained. But at the end of the day, these forces are all fighting these Japanese divisions in Ichigo as well. And we're supplying the air. So I've been bad to Chennault, I'll be good to Chennault. Chennault's Air Force folks are supporting these Chinese units all over China. And there are airfields all over China. One of the reasons the Japanese did Ichigo was to take these airfields out, especially the ones where bombers could come into and then get to the Japanese main islands. Here you have Hurley, Chiang, and Wedemeyer on the top, and at the bottom you see Stillwell and Dole. So this is in October of 44, Stillwell's relieved, mostly because Hurley takes off his 2-star general uniform and will become the U.S. ambassador to China. His report back to FDR is Chiang Kaishek and Stillwell cannot get along and there's no way to fix it. And what FDR says about his fighting general, who you'll find pictures of in Life magazine and Time magazine, I have to go with the head of a country over the head of one of my armies. So Stillwell is relieved and Wedemeyer comes up. The theater is split, and it's no longer a China-Burma-India theater. There's a China theater run by Wedemeyer and a Burma-India theater that's run by Daniel Sultan. This is a picture of Sultan, which is a great picture. He's much more Stillwell-like, a real field soldier. He's sitting here in a chair with stars on his soft cap with a .30 caliber carbine across his lap. He is in the fight. And this is him with a formation. Who is the Mars Force? After Merrill's Marauders collapses at the end of the Michina campaign in August of 44, they are brought out of the line, replacements are brought in, a new regiment is formed from them, and the 124th Cavalry Regiment, Texas National Guard, will be sent to Burma. I have no idea why they were picked, other than mules and horses look sort of alike. And there's all kinds of mules in Burma, and send the cavalry in to play with the mules. There's only one book that I know that was written about the Mars Force, and it's called The Mars Men. But their reputation for fighting in Burma wasn't bad, but their reputation when they went into China was horrible. Because generally speaking, an American infantryman can eat more eggs in one day than a Chinese family would have in a year. We're eating them out of house and home. There's a lot of reasons we didn't put many troops in China. We could feed them in India because we own the land line of communication, but you couldn't feed them in China. So there were a lot of logistics problems in China. North Burma then, Mars Task Force fights with the British 36th Division, more Chinese divisions. So after Michina, this is part of the concerted effort by the British and the Chinese and the Americans under Sultan to take Burma back. We're not going to get Burma back until virtually the end of the war, 45. But we will open the road. The road from India to Kunming, China, will open in February of 45. But in January of 45, the month before that road opens, Wedemeyer came up with a bright idea that we should split the training command from the combat command. Now, it can't be that bad an idea because that's what the United States Army has done today. We have a forces command and we have a training and doctrine command. We split them back in the early 70s. Now, there's some people that say that's not a good idea to put your trainers and your combaters in different places. But Wedemeyer has seemed to have stood the test of time. What Dorn said is, we can't do it that way. My advisors, after they've trained the Chinese, need to go to war with the units that they trained. If you have a training establishment and you have a fighting establishment and they're not joined, their Chinese will not fight because they won't know each other. They won't trust each other. There won't be what you need to have built up in terms of trust over time. And so, as he says in his own memoirs, everything that I told Wedemeyer that he fired me for, he did within the 3 months after I left. They had to put it back together again. But being right doesn't really matter sometimes. What did he do afterwards? Once he was relieved, he went and found Stillwell again. And Stillwell had been put in charge of the 10th Army in Okinawa after General Buckner was killed. And he was one of the senior U.S. Army general to be killed in the Pacific theater was Buckner. So Stillwell replaces him. There's a great picture here of Stillwell poring over a map. It's the cleanup in Okinawa. Dorn is kind of bored. There's nothing going on. So he finds an old friend, General Swing, and says, hey, where are you going, General Swing? And General Swing said, I'm headed for the occupation of Japan. And Dorn says, that sounds great. Can I do that? And the answer is, sure. So Dorn will go to Japan. He will command the 11th Airborne's artillery and will be given a sector of Japan, and he will basically be part of the occupation. The 11th Airborne Division is the first U.S. Army unit to land in Japan, and nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. Churchill has supposedly said the bravest act by a general officer in World War II was when MacArthur got off the plane at Atsugi, because we really didn't know what was going to happen. Well, the 1st Division on the ground is the 11th, and Dorn is the Divardi commander. And it went, as everybody knows, it's the most peaceful occupation of another nation after a war in history. Tom, would you agree or disagree with that? Thank you. My Japan guy, I don't try to get too far off of China. Dorn did. What happens after that? He will come back to Carlisle Barracks, and he will help set up the U.S. Army Information School and then the Armed Forces Information School, and will go to work for General Joseph Lawton Collins. If there was one thing that Dorn could do, it was find officers to work for that he could get along with, many of which did very well. And so Dorn is kind of the perfect public affairs officer. He's worked with newspaper people in China. He knows newspaper people. He knows authors. He's authored books. He's social. He's the perfect guy. And so he becomes the school's assistant commandant, and it's here that he's awarded his second Distinguished Service Medal for service. What else did he do? Well, the war with Korea is going on. He does not go to the war in Korea. He's at the public affairs school. He is at the testing of atomic weapons in Nevada. And there are some that argue that he died early of cancer, may have been related. That's a whole other issue. He has been demoted from brigadier general by Wedemeyer, as you saw in that OER officer efficiency report that I started with. Basically, he gets it back. He's promoted in January of '52 to brigadier and retires a couple of years later. So let me end with another part of this OER. This officer is bright, clever, and decisive. He is of questionable loyalty, uncooperative, extremely selfish, of immature judgment, and not dependable. So not only is he 499 out of 500, this is what Wedemeyer thinks of him. Now, if everything else I've said in this story about him, if only half of it's true, does that look right to you? Didn't look right to me either. But it does point to how cliques form in organizations. And there were those that were the Stillwell people, and then there were the Wedemeyer people. And both of these guys are revered in the United States Army. Wedemeyer has a chair at our second-year program at Fort Leavenworth, the SAMS program. Yet Stillwell, there's a Stillwell Hall in Fort Benning, a staff officer extraordinaire and a soldier extraordinaire. And in between them is Dorn. And Dorn can work for one, but not for the other. Now, Chief of Staff of the Army, Matthew Ridgway, and our leadership department has a lesson on Ridgway and his leadership. And this is what Ridgway says about him. Your distinguished service in coping with the manifold problems of the vital China-Burma-India theater, both in training and in combat, won for you not only our own admiration, but that of the Chinese government as well. So if you're Dorn, do you really care what Wedemeyer says? Wedemeyer never became the Chief of Staff of the Army, as far as I know. So at the end of the day, now I have two books up there. One is Stillwell and the American Experience in China by Tuckman. It's probably the most famous book. It's also famously wrong in a lot of places. And the senior China historian, John King Fairbank at Harvard, was in China. And several military officers wrote to him and said, here's what's wrong with Barbara Tuckman's book. It's like 60 pages long. So this controversy of Hurley, Chennault, Stillwell, Wedemeyer went on up until this book was written in 1973, and this just started it again. Because this book makes Stillwell look like a god. He just looks perfect, and he certainly isn't. But what is he? So anybody in here read Anton Meyer's book, Once an Eagle? Well, in that you have the two officers, Massengale and Damien. Damien Stillwell, Massengale is Wedemeyer. It's only 800 pages long. You can get it cheap on the internet. And the other book is his own book on the Sino-Japanese War. Now, let me end with who the hell are Fayos? Well, you just heard of one. His name is Vinh. I'm not saying that Vinh Nguyen is today's Dole, but he is certainly in the middle of the storm, like being between Wedemeyer and Stillwell. Speaks languages, knows the culture, is adept at the political military level. That's what foreign area officers were trained for. And when Wedemeyer, who also served in the 15th Infantry Regiment in China, was asked, do you want to be a FAO, foreign area officer, and do the 4-year language and culture and travel program? He said, no, there's no future in it. It is a very, very difficult job. It was then, and it is today, because of where they put FAOs, where they put the foreign area officers. They put them in diplomatic harm's way, they put them in military harm's way, and they put them in academic harm's way if you tried to learn the Chinese language. So I'll offer that before. On the other side of the house, we are on our way to building units. You're going to see American soldiers with right sleeve combat patches that says advisor. And this is their patch. And there's, I think, 6 of these units right now, 5 in the active and 1 in the National Guard. And these units are going to have been deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, will be deployed around the world to train foreign armies. And this book on Dorn and the pieces in it that talk about his training the Chinese, in some ways is a model for that. So with that, questions, thoughts, corrections? Tom?
How Army training each year as we speak, and do they do part of their training on the territory of the People's Republic?
Right now, we train between 4 and 5 a year. In my class, there were 4 of us, but we were joined by a 5th who was going to go teach Chinese at West Point. So we had 5 guys that we traveled around with. So in the cohorts after me, it's normally 4 and 1 Marine. If you ever heard of Samuel B. Griffith, who basically translated Sun Tzu and translated Mao and Guerrilla War, he was the Marine doing the training in China with Stillwell back in 1919 to 1923. So there is a long string of the China Foreign Area officers. And I think there are 16 different FAO specialties. So we have basically people training all over the world. Sir.
Thank you for coming. I once heard that Roosevelt was totally exasperated with Chiang Kaishek, and to the point that he once hinted that Chiang Kaishek should be eliminated.
Yeah, there is a couple of pages in the book that indicates that Stillwell asked Dorn to plan that assassination. But it was like, is this a good idea? Is somebody really going to order this? And according to Dorn, it was going to be an aircraft accident. I mean, when you lose a lot of planes over the hump, what's one more with Chiang Kai-shek in it? Especially if it's a Chinese crew flying it. So Dorn argues that that was true. But sometimes there is some ability to think your way through something and go, maybe that's not a good idea. Please, sir.
Since nobody else is asking. In the case of Burma, I don't know much about it except that it was a total slog.
Yes.
Why could the Allies engage the Japanese through guerrilla warfare and not try to bring main force against main force?
I'll ask you to read Mao on Guerrilla War, 1937. Can you win through guerrilla war? No. It's an adjunct to what must emerge as conventional large-scale war. So the answer is, we had the OSS in Burma. We had the same thing as the Jedburghs in Yugoslavia. We had a similar organization. We had actually 2 similar organizations. One in China, OSS in China, which was run by the Navy, a guy named Admiral Milton E. Miles, and he wrote his book after. That was to train Chiang Kai-shek's forces as guerrillas to fight the Japanese. But in Burma, there was OSS Detachment 101 through 106 that were formed. And they were quite effective as adjuncts to the British Chindits and Merrill's Marauders and the Chinese units that came in. But at the end of the day, we tend to forget the Japanese were a very, very well-trained, well-equipped, disciplined unit that fought extremely well. In Slim's book, Defeat into Victory, at the end, he says, what they did to our soldiers, what they did to the civilians, will go down in infamy. But soldier against soldier in the jungle, the Japanese soldier was an amazing enemy. So we talked today about something called hybrid war, where we're going to use guerrillas and main force units in conjunction. But you're not going to win a guerrilla war with guerrillas. One of our colleagues, Gary Bjorgi, I think, talked in here one time about the Why High campaign. When you talk about Chinese communists in guerrilla war, when there's armies of hundreds of thousands fighting armies of hundreds of thousands, that's not guerrilla war. As old Jim Wilbanks used to say, It's not guerrilla war when the enemy's in tanks. Great. Sir?
How well did the Chinese divisions trained by Dorn do, either against the Japanese or against the Chinese communists?
I'm going to argue that, well, in 1937, as the Chinese divisions that were trained by the Germans, trained and equipped by the Germans, they fought quite well from Shanghai to Nanjing to Wuhan. But they were ordered to do really stupid things by Chiang Kaishek. Chiang Kaishek has been rehabilitated in a couple of biographies of late, and I don't agree with the rehabilitation. I think he was a political warlord and not much else, and not much of a strategist. But he put his best divisions against the Japanese in Shanghai, fell back on Nanjing and told them to hold at all costs, fell back to Wuhan. And if they had just fallen back and drawn the Japanese in, because there are two fights, Tai-er-Zhuang, which is known as the Stalingrad of China, and the battles around Changsha, where the Chinese did very well against the Japanese. But they had to bring them in, they had to get them at the end of their supply lines, they had to get them at the ends, their places where their air power and artillery couldn't be moved as easily or be as effective, and then the Chinese could be effective. But in that 1937 to 1940 era, it took 10 Chinese divisions to defeat one Japanese division. By the time the units that we had trained were going up against the Japanese in northern Burma, it was more like 2 to 3 to 1. So I would argue that we increased the capabilities of the Chinese armies by about threefold. But we brought air power with us. We had 2 tank regiments that we built of Chinese, and we like a lot of artillery, and we try to give them a lot of artillery. So we tried to build them to have the combat power to go up against the Japanese. They were very much an infantry army with not knowing how to use their artillery very well. And as you saw here with Dorn, the strength of the United States Army in World War II, sadly, for some of the artillerymen that are in the room, was the artillery. It was magnificent. And so I think we improved them a lot, but the Germans had built some very, very good divisions as well. Stillwell said very early on, the only thing the average Chinese soldier needs is good leadership. He's hardy, he's brave, he makes a great soldier. They just have horrible leaders. And the horrible leaders were Chiang Kaishek and all the political military clowns that were underneath him. We started to build the captains, the majors, lieutenant colonels to take in. Now there was one exception, and I think I had a picture of him in here. There was one Chinese officer who graduated from Purdue, then went to VMI, and commanded the 38th Chinese Division. And there were highlights. But Chiang Kai-shek put him under house arrest when he went to Taiwan because he was scared to death he'd take over for him. So Dorn, in Dorn's papers out at Stanford, there's a sheaf of handwritten notes where he basically writes a paragraph on all the Chinese generals that he was working with. And it sounded only good for playing mahjong with. Shouldn't be allowed out of the country for any reason. I mean, he just rips them a new one. And then every once in a while there's this nugget. This officer will make a great division commander. So in this list, he picks out the ones that he knows are combat soldiers. Well, I know we started a little late, so there's people that need to go eat, I'm sure.
You can wave this off as too current, but with your Chinese expertise, can you comment on the situation in Hong Kong and how close are we to military force there?
I lived in Hong Kong 1984-85, and I traveled to Hong Kong all the way through the 80s and into the 90s, working with the Brits. The Brits left in 97. We were working with the British units all the way till turnover. So let me tell you to reach into your pocket, pull out a coin, and flip it. Because there's as many reasons for the Chinese not to go into Hong Kong as there are for the Chinese to go into Hong Kong. So if I wake up tomorrow morning in the Chinese military, there's about 8,000 to 10,000 of them within Hong Kong itself. Plus there's the Royal Hong Kong Police that are very good. The United States, in the bill that was just passed, has sent Xi Jinping a message. If this is what the United States thinks about what they're doing in Hong Kong, what happens if the PLA is let loose? What happens? And so I have been waiting for, and I think Xi Jinping has been waiting for, the business people, the mothers and fathers of the kids in the street, to tell the kids to stay home. You know, it's like, wouldn't you like to go to Disney World? Here's a ticket. Get on the plane, get the hell out of here for a while. But there's a hardcore of people in Hong Kong that know what democracy looks like. And they're tenacious. The northern Chinese do not like the southern Chinese. The southern Chinese are Cantonese. They're different than the northern Chinese. The northern Chinese, you know, they're Manchus. The Mongols and the Manchus have spent too much time amongst them. And they're big and they're tall. And the guys down south are just fiery. So there's going to be a cultural misunderstanding within China. There's no monolithic understanding of China. It is regional still. So there's a regional issue at play. Then there's where does Xi Jinping want to go in the relationship with the United States in the middle of a trade war? Does he want to put the President of the United States in this position? And should it just burn itself out? Historically, I was in Hong Kong for 18 months. There were 2 sets of riots in Hong Kong where we didn't have school for a week and stayed home. But this is so incessant. And the GDP in Hong Kong. But let's get back to the GDP in Hong Kong. When I was in Hong Kong in 84, 85, we had just, in 1979, had changed the relationship between the United States and China. And so Hong Kong, for time immemorial, from 49 to 79, was the port that you had to go through to trade with China. And then in 1979, boom, now you can go to Shenzhen, and you can go to Shanghai, and you can go to Fujian. You don't have to just go to Hong Kong. So Hong Kong went from the #1 entrepot to now it's one of 10 or one of 20. So it's not as important economically as it used to be. So I've rattled on now to tell you I have no earthly idea. I wake up one morning and say, they got to come in, they've got to stop this mess. And I get up the next morning and say, there's another one more point. Every day the Chinese people wake up and see these riots on national TV in mainland China. The Chinese Communist Party goes, is that what you want? Because democracy equals chaos. And chaos was 1966 to 76, the Great Cultural Revolution. That was chaos of the left. This is chaos of the right. I would bet if you walked into China tomorrow and grabbed 100 Chinese at Walmart and said, what do you want to do about Hong Kong? It would be crush them. Because they don't know that they're destroying all that good economic stuff. Because the average Chinese has never been better off in history than they are right now because of what happened in 1979 and has continued. Which is, as long as you shut up and color, you can make money, Alibaba. Let it go. So it's a great question. I will be as surprised as you are when the TVs show me what happens. My hope is that it just fizzles over time, but it's not fizzling very slowly.
Yes.
And I am not speaking on the part of the Trump administration, the United States Army, or anybody other than Geoff Babb.
Well, this may verge a little bit too close to that, but you mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Vinland, and where is the duty station he is right now, and what is the likely next duty station to somebody that is an advisor like he is?
I'm going to make the same story. Flip a coin. I mean, everybody knows him, and it's hard to doubt he's a patriot. And so far, the Secretary of Defense Esper, who used to be the Secretary of the Army, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Milley, who used to be the Chief of Staff of the Army, have basically, they didn't stop him from going to testify. I don't think they'll stop him from going again, and I think they're going to go, the chips will fall where they may. Is he going to make 06? If he can hang on after the 20 election and the Democrats come to power, he could be a 3-star. Or he could hit a Wedemeyer and be a lieutenant colonel for life in New York City. If there's one thing that should come out of my story is, fate has a lot to do with it, or luck, or who you know, or the fact that Stillwell and Dorn got to know each other and stayed that close made all the difference in the world in terms of assignments. It's not quite that way in the Army anymore, but as a foreign area officer, having been an attaché in the Ukraine, he should be stacked up, and wounded combat veteran, he should be stacked up to make 06 full colonel. If he just retires tomorrow afternoon, that's why I told you to flip the coin. But again, I don't think he would, because as a civilian, he might be more of an issue. So welcome to politics at the highest level if you're a poor old Army lieutenant colonel. Sir.
Probably have time for a few more.
So it's sort of accepted early on in the 20th century America was fairly isolationist. What was the motive behind having any military foothold in China? Was it to sort of compete with the British in Hong Kong, or was it to sort of have any international presence? Or
All right, I don't want to make a long answer to this. We were very slow to come to the embassy attaché game. But once we did, we went everywhere. I just read the numbers. The Chinese just now have more embassies and consulates worldwide than we do. That just happened in the last year. But after the American Civil War, we start the empire. I mean, if you don't count Oklahoma and Arizona, where does empire begin? Well, once Hawaii was kind of nice, the Philippines. So 1898, we become a global power. First World War, we become a global power. But there's always half of America that don't want to go anywhere, do anything, stay home, because this is a great place. I don't need any place else. So I would argue that the isolationists have always been there, and the empirists have always been there. The empirists always hide behind something else, because nobody likes to say, I'm for empire. The biggest problem we made was not making the Philippines a 51st state. And Cuba should have been 52. That wasn't going to go over very well. But in terms of spreading out and being part of this broader community, I think it comes about after the First World War. Tom or somebody else want to help me with this one? Good question.
I agree. It gets a good start after the Spanish-American War, and then becomes their kind of national passion after World War I. It has, I guess, a lot of momentum after World War I under Wilson's nationalism.
But I just heard it on the radio this morning. We have 20 ambassador posts that are unfilled right now. So if an isolationist is where you don't send ambassadors, we seem to be trending back towards that a bit. But on the other hand, there's also a thing, we're sending 14,000 more troops to Saudi Arabia. So, oh, we're isolationists. Oh, no, we're not. So, hey, wake up, flip a coin, isolationists today, not tomorrow. Last, sir.
What was MacArthur's role, if any, in the China-India-Burma theater. Did he have his fingers in the pot at all?
Other than to say no. It's very interesting. Wedemeyer goes, and I'm going to try to pick the time. I think it is May of 45. There is a meeting that, I'm sorry, yeah. Somewhere between May, there's a meeting, and then in August, there's a meeting. And Wedemeyer asked MacArthur for 8 divisions to occupy China, because Chiang Kai-shek's forces were all in the center and southwest. Mao's forces were both north and south of the Yangtze and up in the northeast. So Chiang Kai-shek had to have help moving his forces from the Chongqing area to the east. And so we will do that. We will do that with advisors. But we need it so. MacArthur looked at Wedemeyer and said, no, dude, I got him. I'm going to need him for Japan. Look, I don't like Marines very much. You can have 2 Marine divisions. He gave him the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force with, I think, the 1st and 6th Marines, and said, Marines like China, send them over. So instead of getting 8 divisions, he got 2 Marine divisions. And those Marine divisions will stay there through the 40s, through the late 40s before they move out of, there's a detachment that moves out of Qingdao with the Navy in the mid-48. But no, it's a question that I try to ask. Why didn't MacArthur pay attention to China? And it's not that he didn't travel there. He traveled there with his father. And it wasn't that he didn't know the area, but he said Japan is the answer, in my opinion. He said Japan is the answer. Tom, you're probably better at this. Why didn't MacArthur care about China? Other than sake tastes better than that white lightning that the Chinese make.
MacArthur is otherwise occupied. He's fighting the war. His real passion is the Philippines, and he thinks from there. His great thing is to push the Japanese out of the Philippines, and then he becomes the head of the occupation. He has no sympathy with the Chinese communists at all. So once they're in, that sort of eliminates all his interest in any territory under their jurisdiction, which was practically all of it. So I think the answer is mainly that's just not his bailiwick until very late.
Now, again, you can't be more wrong than MacArthur, since Kansas is close to Missouri, and I know all of you love Truman, you cannot be more wrong than MacArthur. Wrong to the point of being relieved by Truman. But he consistently underestimates the Chinese, and he seems to act like he doesn't really understand it, which is kind of odd, I think. But he had plenty to do in the Philippines, he had plenty to do in Japan, and he got plenty to do in Korea, and he was old enough he should have retired, which probably I should. But the MacArthur's just a fascinating figure. And Chiang Kai-shek has been rehabilitated. His diaries were translated, and a couple of books, a guy named Jay Taylor wrote a book on it. I'm just not convinced that Chiang Kai-shek was a very reliable partner, and that gets FDR's goat, it gets Marshall's goat, and Stillwell just don't care. He just hammers him, calls him peanut on a raft, apparently to his face. And so it doesn't go well. Sir, that was the last question. Thank you very much. I hope you found it interesting.